My name is Fiona Sheehan. I am 34 years old. 7 years ago, I stopped answering my parents' calls, and I built a life so quiet they forgot to notice it. Then one Tuesday night in March, my father called me from a hallway outside room 4 of the neonatal intensive care unit, where I have worked for 11 years, and he did not know it was my unit. He did not know I was the charge nurse who would be standing over his granddaughter's isolette in less than an hour. He said my name like a question, like he wasn't sure the woman on the other end was really his daughter anymore. Let me take you back to how we got to that hallway. I grew up in Roanoke, Virginia, in a narrow brick house on a street called Persinger Road, where the maple trees dropped so much shade in summer that our porch never got direct sun until almost 5 in the evening. My father, Harold Sheehan, worked for the railroad in the yard offices near downtown, doing scheduling work that he never talked about much at dinner. My mother, Marlene Sheehan, kept the house and worked part-time at a fabric store on weekends, and she had opinions about everything, delivered in a voice that never rose but never softened either. I was the older of 2 daughters. My sister, Bridget, was 2 years younger than me, and from the earliest years I can remember, the house ran on a kind of gravity that pulled everything toward her. Part of it was my heart. When I was 6 years old, I was diagnosed with a mild arrhythmia, a fluttering, irregular heartbeat that a pediatric cardiologist in Roanoke monitored twice a year until I was 14. It was never dangerous. The cardiologist, a soft-spoken man named Dr. Abernathy, told my parents plainly at every visit that I could run, swim, ride my bike, do anything a normal kid did. But my mother decided early that I was fragile. She said it in front of me more times than I can count. Fiona has to be careful. Fiona can't get too worked up. She said it to teachers, to neighbors, to the woman who cut our hair. By the time I was 10, I had absorbed the idea that I was breakable in some way my sister was not, and that belief did something strange to how the house treated me. Bridget was never sick a day in her life. She broke her arm once falling off the monkey bars in 3rd grade, and my mother tells that story to this day like it was a war wound earned in defense of the family honor. Meanwhile, my twice-yearly cardiologist visits, which were routine and unremarkable, got folded into a family narrative where I was the delicate one who required management. Not care. Management. There is a difference, and I did not understand that difference until I was much older and had spent years around actual sick children, actual fragile bodies, actual medical fear. What my mother called fragility in me was never fear for my safety. It was a role she assigned me so that Bridget could be assigned the opposite one. Bridget was the strong one. I was the one who needed watching. By the time I reached middle school, this had calcified into something almost ritualized. At Thanksgiving, Bridget got to carry the turkey in from the kitchen because it was heavy and I shouldn't strain. At Christmas, Bridget got to help my father put the star on the tree because she could handle the ladder and I could not, despite the fact that I was taller than her by the time I was 12. Small things. None of them on their own worth mentioning to anyone. But you stack enough small things, and eventually they become the architecture of how a family sees you. I was the girl who watched from the couch. Bridget was the girl who did things. My father was quieter than my mother, but no less consistent in how he applied this. Harold Sheehan believed in a certain kind of order. He liked things settled and predictable, and my mother's narrative about my fragility gave him an easy category to slot me into. He didn't argue with it. He reinforced it by omission, by not correcting her, by nodding along when she said I needed to sit this one out or skip that field trip. I don't think my father was cruel by nature. I think he was a man who found it easier to agree with his wife than to look closely at either of his daughters. That kind of passive agreement did as much damage over 18 years as anything my mother said outright. Maybe more, because it never announced itself as anything at all. When I was 15, I started volunteering at Carilion Roanoke Memorial Hospital, folding linens and restocking supply carts in the pediatric wing on Saturday mornings. I had asked my parents for permission almost apologetically, bracing for my mother to say it would be too much for me. She surprised me by saying yes, mostly, I think, because it got me out of the house and required no effort from her. I did not tell her what actually happened to me in that hospital. I fell in love with it. Not the drama of it, not the trauma of it, the precision of it. The way a nurse named Consuelo Alvarez could walk into a room where a mother was crying and a monitor was beeping and somehow lower the temperature of the entire situation just by the pace of her voice. I watched her do that more than once, and I remember thinking very clearly at 15 years old, I want to be able to do that. I told my mother I wanted to become a nurse when I was 16. She laughed. Not cruelly, not even dismissively in the way I'd expect looking back, but with a kind of genuine surprise that stung more than meanness would have. "You get lightheaded during your own blood draws, Fiona," she said. "You really think you're going to handle other people's blood?" It wasn't true. I had gotten lightheaded exactly once, at age 9, during a particularly long cardiology appointment where I hadn't eaten breakfast. But the story had ossified into fact in my mother's mind, the same way all the other small inaccuracies about me had. I didn't argue. I had learned by then that arguing with my mother's version of me rarely worked. I just kept volunteering on Saturdays and kept my plans mostly to myself. Bridget, meanwhile, had decided by 17 that she wanted to go into real estate, following our maternal grandfather who had made a modest but comfortable living selling houses in Salem, just outside Roanoke, for 30 years. My parents treated this decision like a coronation. There were dinners where my father brought up Bridget's business mind unprompted. There was a graduation gift, a laptop, presented to Bridget the week she finished her real estate licensing course at 19, with a card that said, "For our girl who's going to build something." I had graduated from nursing school's prerequisite program that same spring with a 3.8 grade point average, and I got a card that said, "Congratulations," and nothing else, no gift, not even a phone call on the day itself, because my parents were at Bridget's licensing celebration dinner that night. I want to be clear about something before I go further into this story. I am not telling you this to make my parents into monsters. I have thought about this more than almost anything else in my adult life, and what I've come to understand is that my parents were, in their own limited and frightened way, terrified of things they never said out loud. My mother grew up the youngest of 6 children in a house outside Lynchburg where nobody had enough attention to go around, and I think she built her entire identity around being the one who noticed things, who managed things, who assigned roles so that nothing ever felt unpredictable. Unpredictability, to my mother, was the enemy. A fragile daughter was predictable. A daughter who wanted to work in a hospital around dying infants and unstable hearts was not. My father, I think, was simply afraid of conflict with my mother. Every year I watched him, and every year I saw a man who had decided decades earlier that peace in his marriage mattered more than justice between his daughters. He was not a bad man. He was a man who chose the path of least resistance every single time it was offered to him, and over 18 years, that path had a shape, and the shape was always in my sister's favor. There is one more memory from those teenage years I want to include, because it shaped me as much as anything that happened later. During my second summer volunteering, a set of twins came through the pediatric wing after a car accident that killed their mother. I was 16. I was only allowed to restock supplies and change linens, nothing clinical, but I watched the nurses on that floor work an entire overnight shift without a single wasted motion, coordinating with social workers, with a grief counselor, with an aunt who arrived at 2 in the morning still in her work uniform from a night shift of her own. Nobody in that hallway raised their voice. Nobody performed their exhaustion for an audience. They simply did the next necessary thing over and over until the sun came up and the twins were stable and the aunt had somewhere real to sit down. I remember thinking that this was the opposite of how my house worked, where every small hardship got narrated, cataloged, turned into a story about who had suffered more. In that hospital hallway, suffering wasn't a currency. It was simply something you addressed quietly with your hands and your training, and then you moved to the next room. I decided that night, more firmly than I had decided anything before, that I wanted to live my working life inside that kind of quiet rather than my mother's kind of narration. I finished my nursing degree at Radford University when I was 22, graduating with honors, and I took a job at Carilion Roanoke Memorial in the neonatal intensive care unit, the same hospital where I had folded linens as a teenager. I chose the NICU deliberately. I wanted the hardest, most precise work in the building. Premature infants, some of them barely the length of my forearm, hooked to ventilators and feeding tubes, their whole existence measured in grams and oxygen saturation percentages. It is not gentle work. It requires steady hands and a steadier voice, because the parents in that unit are often living through the worst weeks of their lives, and the nurse in the room is sometimes the only calm thing they can hold on to. My parents did not come to my pinning ceremony. This is the first of the wrongs I want to tell you about, the first rung on a ladder that got higher and worse over the following years. A pinning ceremony, for those who don't know, is a small tradition in nursing school graduations, where new nurses are formally pinned with a badge in front of family, faculty, and the professionals who trained them. It happens the same week as the general university commencement, but it is its own separate, smaller event, and it matters enormously to nursing students, because it is the moment your professional identity is recognized by name in front of the people who raised you. My mother told me 2 weeks before the ceremony that she and my father couldn't make it because Bridget had a closing that same weekend on her first solo real estate sale, a townhouse in Salem that sold for $214,000, and they wanted to be there to celebrate with her at the title office and then take her to dinner. "You'll have plenty of these moments in your career, Fiona," my mother said on the phone. "Bridget's first sale only happens once." I remember standing in my apartment kitchen holding the phone and feeling something in my chest go very still and very quiet, the way a monitor sounds right before an alarm, not yet ringing but already wrong. I did not argue. I said okay. I went to my pinning ceremony with my roommate from nursing school, a woman named Odalise Ferreira, and her mother, who cried more during my pinning than my own mother had cried at anything in 18 years. The second wrong came 4 years later, and it was smaller in one sense and larger in another. My parents celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary with a dinner at a restaurant in downtown Roanoke, and they hired a photographer to document the whole evening. I was invited, technically. I was seated at the dinner. But when the photographer began organizing family portraits, my mother quietly steered me to the edge of every shot, positioning Bridget and her husband, a mild-mannered man named Emmett Rourke, who sold commercial insurance, directly in the center next to my parents every single time. I noticed it happening in real time. I stood at the edge of 4 different photographs that night, half cropped out of 2 of them when the final prints came back weeks later. When I brought it up gently to my mother afterward, over the phone, she told me I was reading into things and that I always found a way to make things about being left out. She said it so calmly, so certainly, that for a moment I almost believed her. Almost. I want to pause here and tell you something about how these 2 wrongs function together, because I think it matters. Neither one alone would have broken anything. People miss ceremonies. Photographers arrange people however they arrange them. But by the time the anniversary dinner happened, I already had 4 years of data telling me exactly where I stood in that family, and the photograph incident didn't teach me anything new. It confirmed what I already knew. That is how this kind of exclusion works. It rarely arrives as a single devastating blow. It arrives as a pattern, and the pattern is the actual wound, not any one instance of it. I met my husband, Callum Bracken, during my 2nd year working in the NICU. He was a respiratory therapist on the same unit, a broad-shouldered man with sandy brown hair and a laugh that carried down the hallway further than he ever seemed to realize. We married when I was 28, in a small ceremony at a chapel outside Roanoke with maybe 40 guests. And my parents came to that wedding and behaved, for one evening, like a completely ordinary mother and father. I remember thinking, foolishly, that maybe things were shifting. Maybe the wedding was a kind of reset. I was wrong, but I didn't know that yet, and for 2 more years I let myself believe things were simply improving with time, the way relationships sometimes do once everyone is a little older and a little less competitive about things that no longer matter. Callum and I had our son, Ryan, 3 years into our marriage, when I was 31. And this is where I need to tell you about the 3rd wrong, the one that ended everything, the one that took me from a woman who quietly tolerated her family's neglect to a woman who stopped answering the phone entirely. Ryan was born at 29 weeks. I went into premature labor on a Sunday afternoon in October, 6 weeks after a diagnosis of preeclampsia that had already put me on modified bed rest and constant monitoring. My blood pressure spiked without warning during what should have been a routine check, and within 4 hours, I was in an operating room at Carilion Roanoke Memorial, the same hospital where I worked, delivering my son by emergency cesarean at 2 pounds 11 ounces. He was rushed immediately to the neonatal intensive care unit, my own unit. My own colleagues took over his care because I could not, because a mother cannot be the nurse for her own child, and I remember lying in a recovery bed unable to walk yet, sobbing, asking Callum to go find out if our son was breathing on his own or if they had intubated him. Ryan spent 23 days in that unit. 23 days of watching a monitor with numbers I understood better than most parents ever will, which made it both easier and unbearably harder, because I knew exactly what every alarm meant and exactly how bad things could still get. I called my mother the night Ryan was born, from a hospital phone, because my own phone battery had died sometime during the chaos of the delivery. I told her Ryan had been born at 29 weeks and was in the NICU on a ventilator. There was a long pause on the line. Then she said, "Oh, Fiona, that sounds so stressful for you." Not for Ryan, for me. as though the difficulty here was my emotional burden and not my son's fight to survive. My mother did not come to the hospital, neither did my father. 3 days went by, then a week. I called again on day 9, when Ryan had a brief but frightening episode of bradycardia, his heart rate dropping low enough that 2 nurses had to stimulate him back to a normal rhythm while I stood at the isolette gripping the metal frame so hard my knuckles went white. I told my mother about it that evening, my voice still shaking. She said, "I just don't do well in those environments, Fiona. All those tubes and machines. It's too depressing for me. You know how I get." I remember standing in the hallway outside the family lounge, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, and feeling something crack open in my chest that had been cracking slowly for 28 years. Here is the detail that finished it. On day 14 of Ryan's NICU stay, while my son was still on a ventilator 2 floors below me, my sister Bridget had her second child, a healthy full-term baby girl named after our mother. My parents drove to Bridget's hospital in Salem, 40 minutes away, the same day the baby was born. They stayed for 6 hours. My mother posted photographs on Facebook that evening, holding her new granddaughter, captioned "Grateful for healthy grandbabies and a family that shows up for each other." I saw that post on my phone at 11 at night, sitting in a recliner beside my son's isolette, an alarm chirping softly because his oxygen saturation had dipped below 90% again, which happened 4 or 5 times a night during that stretch. I read the caption twice. Then I put my phone face down on the little rolling table beside the recliner and did not pick it back up for 3 days. Callum found me crying in the hospital chapel 2 days later, the small one on the ground floor with the stained glass window that never quite matched the hour of day it was letting light through. I told him what I had realized, sitting there. It wasn't that my parents loved Bridget more, though they did. It was that my parents had built an entire family mythology in which I was the fragile one who caused stress simply by existing in difficult circumstances, and that mythology gave them permission to abandon me at the exact moment I needed them most, and then frame their abandonment as self-care. I don't do well in those environments. As if my son's life was an environment they were entitled to opt out of. Ryan came home on a Tuesday in November, 23 days after he was born, weighing 4 pounds 2 ounces, still needing a home oxygen monitor for another 6 weeks. My parents came to see him twice in his first year of life. Twice. Both visits lasted under an hour. My mother held him for maybe 10 minutes total across both visits, commenting once that he seemed awfully small still, as though this were a personal failing of mine rather than the ordinary trajectory of an infant born 11 weeks early. I did not confront them. I did not scream. I did not write an angry letter cataloging every slight going back to childhood. I simply, quietly, over the following 4 months, stopped calling. I stopped answering when they called. I sent one final text message to my mother in March, 5 months after Ryan was born, that said only, "I need some space from this family for a while. Please don't call. I'll reach out if that changes." She replied with a single line, "This is so dramatic, Fiona. Typical." I did not respond to that either. That was the last direct communication I had with either of my parents for 7 years. I want to tell you about the years that followed, because they matter just as much as the wrongs that preceded them. This was not a period of anger or plotting. It was a period of building, quietly, the way you build a house you intend to actually live in rather than one you're constructing to prove a point to anyone. Callum and I stayed in Roanoke. I continued working in the NICU at Carilion, and within 3 years I was promoted to charge nurse of the night shift, a role that put me in charge of staffing decisions, triage priorities, and direct communication with the neonatologists on call for every critical case that came through the unit. It is a demanding position. Charge nurses in a level III NICU are the ones who decide, in real time, which infant needs which nurse's full attention when 3 babies are crashing at once. I earned that role. Nobody gave it to me. I sat for a national certification in neonatal intensive care nursing 2 years after Ryan came home, studying at our kitchen table after he went to sleep, and I passed it on my first attempt. My sister Bridget, during those same 7 years, built a genuinely successful real estate career in the Roanoke Valley, and I want to be honest that I do not begrudge her that success. She worked hard for it. That was never the wound. The wound was never that Bridget did well. The wound was that my parents made her success a referendum on my worth over and over for 3 decades, and then abandoned my child in an incubator so they could go celebrate hers. I want to describe one particular night from those silent years, because it captures better than any summary what the work actually demanded of me. It was a Thursday in late February, about 4 years into the no-contact stretch, and I was covering a pod with 3 critically unstable infants at once, something that happens more often than people outside the unit would guess. One baby, born at 24 weeks, had an intestinal complication that required an emergency transfer to a surgical team. A second baby was recovering from a cardiac procedure and needed hourly assessments. A third had parents in the room who were terrified and needed someone to simply sit with them for 10 minutes and explain, slowly, what an apnea alarm actually meant. I moved between all 3 for 6 hours without a real break, coordinating with 2 residents, a respiratory therapist, and an on-call surgeon. And at 4 in the morning, I finally sat down at the nurse's station and realized my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer physical toll of sustained precision. Nobody in my family knew that night happened. Nobody asked what my job actually required of me on an average Thursday. I built an entire professional identity, one demanding shift at a time, in a silence so complete that the people who raised me had no idea what their daughter had become capable of. During the no-contact years, my chosen family became a woman named Odalise Ferreira, my old nursing school roommate, who by then had moved to Roanoke herself and worked as a labor and delivery nurse 2 floors above my unit. Odalise had grown up in a large, chaotic, deeply affectionate family in Newport News, and she treated my exile from my own parents the way you'd treat a broken bone, something that needed real tending, not something to be brushed past. She came to our house every Sunday for almost 4 years, bringing a dish of arroz con pollo that her own grandmother had taught her to make, and she would sit with Ryan on the living room floor building block towers while Callum and I got an hour of actual rest. She never once told me I should reconcile with my parents. She never once told me I shouldn't either. She simply said, more than once, "You get to decide what family means, Fiona. Nobody else gets a vote on that." Odalise moved to Charlotte 4 years into our friendship when her husband's job transferred, and I still call her every other Sunday. She was there when almost no one else was, and I have never stopped being grateful for that particular kind of ordinary, costly loyalty. I also want to mention my direct supervisor during those years, a nurse manager named Yolanda Petrakis, who had run the Carillion NICU for almost 20 years by the time I made charge nurse. Yolanda never knew the details of my family situation, not really, but she noticed things. She noticed that I never mentioned parents at holiday scheduling conversations the way other nurses did. She never asked. She simply, every single year, made sure I got first pick of holiday shifts if I wanted them, understanding without being told that some of her nurses needed the structure of work more than they needed a table to sit at elsewhere. Small mercies like that, offered without commentary, mattered more to me during those years than any grand gesture could have. I want to mention one more figure from those years, because he mattered in a quieter way than Odalys or Yolanda, but mattered nonetheless. Our next-door neighbor, an older widower named Silas Whitcomb, had lived on our street for over 30 years and had raised 3 children of his own who had all moved away for work, to Charlotte and Richmond, and one as far as Seattle. Silas noticed, in the first winter after Ryan came home, that Callum and I were running on almost no sleep, juggling hospital follow-up appointments with full-time jobs and a newborn who still needed oxygen monitoring overnight. Without ever making a production of it, he started shoveling our driveway before we woke up on snow mornings, leaving no note, no expectation of thanks. One February afternoon, he knocked on our door holding a casserole dish and said, simply, "You two look like you're running on fumes. Eat something that isn't cereal tonight." He never asked about my parents. He never asked why grandparents weren't a fixture at our door, the way they seemed to be at other houses on the street. I think he understood, in the quiet way older men sometimes do, that some questions are kinder left unasked. Silas passed away 4 years ago, and at his funeral, held at a small Lutheran church off Williamson Road, I sat with Callum and Ryan in a pew near the back, grieving a man who had shown my son more consistent grandfatherly warmth in 5 years than my own parents had managed in a lifetime. Ryan grew into a curious, sturdy little boy despite his rough start, and by the time he turned 6, he had no lasting complications from his prematurity beyond a mild speech delay that resolved with about a year of therapy. Callum and I bought a house on the north side of Roanoke, a modest 3-bedroom with a maple tree in the front yard, not unlike the ones I grew up under on Persinger Road, though I didn't consciously choose it for that reason. I built a life. 7 years is a long time. It is long enough to become, in every meaningful sense, a different person than the one who left. My sister Bridget reached out twice during those 7 years, both times through text message, both times around a holiday. The first was a Christmas card photo forwarded with the caption, "Miss you, hope you're okay." The second, 2 years later, was a message that said, "Mom's blood pressure has been bad, just thought you should know." I did not respond to either message. I want to be honest that the second one, about my mother's blood pressure, sat with me for several days. I am a medical professional. Some instinct in me wanted to ask questions, wanted to know if she was on the right medication, wanted to offer the kind of practical help I offer strangers every single shift. But I recognized, even through that instinct, that the message was not really an invitation to help. It was an update delivered without context, without an actual request, designed more to needle at my conscience than to genuinely inform me. I let it go. It was not my responsibility to manage my mother's cardiovascular health from a self-imposed exile she had earned honestly. The call that changed everything came on a Tuesday night in March, 7 years and 2 months after I sent that last text to my mother. I was working an overnight shift, the 12-hour kind that runs from 7 in the evening to 7 in the morning, and it was around 11:15 when my charge phone, the direct line the front desk uses to reach whoever is running the unit, rang with an outside call transferred up from the main hospital switchboard. I answered the way I always do. NICU, this is Fiona, charge nurse. There was a pause on the other end, long enough that I almost repeated myself. Then a voice I had not heard in over 7 years said, "Fiona, it's your father." My whole body went still in a way I can only describe as the opposite of surprise. It was recognition, cold and total, arriving all at once. "Harold," I said. I did not say Dad. I hadn't called him Dad out loud in 7 years, and it did not come naturally in that moment, not with a hospital phone in my hand and a unit full of critical infants around me. "I need help," he said, and his voice cracked in a way I had genuinely never heard from my father in 34 years of knowing him. "Bridget's baby. She's here. She's in the NICU," they said. They said it's bad, Fiona. I don't understand what they're telling me. Please. I want to be honest about what happened inside me in the 3 or 4 seconds after he said that. There was a version of me, the 6-year-old told she was fragile, the 22-year-old who went to her own pinning ceremony without her parents, the 31-year-old who read a Facebook caption about grateful grandbabies while her son's oxygen alarm chirped in the background. That version of me wanted to hang up the phone. Not out of cruelty. Out of self-protection, so deeply grooved into me by then that it had become reflex. But there was another version of me standing in that nurse's station at 11:17 at night. And that version was, before anything else, a NICU charge nurse who had sworn an oath about patient care that did not have an asterisk next to it for patients who happened to share blood with people who had hurt me. "What's her name?" I asked. Not "I'll be right there." Not "of course, Dad." Just the question a charge nurse asks first every time. "The baby, what's her name?" My father's voice cracked further. "Saoirse, they said 27 weeks. She came early, something with the placenta, I don't understand the words they're using." I told him to stay in the family waiting room outside the unit doors. That someone would come get him when there was information to share. And I hung up the hospital phone and stood in the nurse's station for perhaps 10 full seconds without moving. Then I did my job. I pulled up the admission that had come in 20 minutes earlier, before my father's call. An admission I had not yet personally reviewed because I had been managing a different crisis on the far end of the unit, an infant in bed 6 going into respiratory distress. Saoirse Rourke, 27 weeks gestation, born via emergency cesarean after a placental abruption, birth weight 1 pound 13 ounces, currently intubated, on the highest ventilator settings we use before considering more invasive intervention. The attending neonatologist that night was a physician named Dr. Amara Nwasu, sharp and exacting, someone I had worked alongside for 6 years and trusted completely. I walked into the pod where Saoirse's isolette sat, and I looked at the numbers on her monitor the way I look at every critical infant's numbers, with the part of my brain that has nothing to do with family and everything to do with training. Her oxygen saturation was unstable, swinging between 84 and 91%. Her heart rate was elevated. The ventilator was doing most of the breathing for her. I checked the settings against the flow sheet, confirmed the umbilical line placement with the resident, and asked Dr. Nwasu, professional to professional, what she was thinking for the next 4 hours. She told me she was concerned about a possible pneumothorax, a collapsed lung, something that happens with tragic frequency in the smallest and earliest infants, and that she wanted a portable chest X-ray within the hour. I did not tell Dr. Nwasu that this infant was my niece. I want to be honest about that, because it matters to how the rest of that night unfolded. I did not use my family connection to insert myself into decisions that were not mine to make. I was the charge nurse on shift, and Saoirse Rourke was, at that moment, simply one of 6 critical infants in my unit, and I treated her exactly the way I treat every infant in that unit, which is to say with everything I have. But I also could not pretend I didn't know who her grandfather was standing in that waiting room. So after I confirmed the X-ray order and reassigned Bed 6's primary nurse to cover an additional patient for 20 minutes, I walked out to the family waiting room myself, still in my scrubs, my badge with my full name and credentials clipped to my chest exactly where it always is. My father stood up so fast his chair scraped backward across the tile floor. My mother was there too. I hadn't known that until I opened the door, sitting with her coat still on, her purse clutched in her lap the way people hold things when they don't know what else to do with their hands. For a moment, nobody said anything. My mother looked at my badge. I watched her eyes move across it, reading my name, reading the credential letters after it, reading the small unit designation beneath. I watched something shift in her face, a recalculation happening in real time, the same recalculation I imagine happens in a courtroom when a piece of evidence lands that changes the whole shape of a case. My mother had spent 34 years believing her older daughter was the fragile one, the one who couldn't handle things, the one who read into slights that weren't there. And here I was, in the exact room where her granddaughter's life was being decided minute by minute, wearing the credentials of the one person in that building who actually understood, in granular technical detail, what was happening to that child. "Fiona," my father said again, and this time it wasn't a question. It was something closer to disbelief. "You work here. You work in this unit." I told him yes. I told him I had worked in this NICU for 11 years and had been charge nurse for 4 of them. I watched him do the math, watched him realize that every year he had not asked me a single question about my career, I had been doing exactly the work that his granddaughter now depended on. I did not say any of this to hurt him. I said it because it was simply the truth of where we all stood in that moment, and truth, delivered flatly, does not require volume to land. My mother spoke next, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it. "Is she going to be okay?" I told her what I knew, professionally, carefully, the same way I would tell any family member. I explained the ventilator settings in plain language. I explained what a pneumothorax was and why Dr. Nwasu was concerned about it, and I explained that we would know more within the hour once the X-ray came back. I did not promise anything, because NICU nurses learn very early never to promise outcomes we cannot control. My mother started crying, quietly, the kind of crying that comes from someone who has spent her whole life managing her emotions in public and has finally run out of the energy required to keep doing it. I stayed in that waiting room for maybe 6 minutes, no more, because I still had 5 other critical infants under my supervision, and a hospital does not stop needing its charge nurse because her family has walked back into her life. But before I left, my father said something I have turned over in my mind many times since. "We didn't know," he said. "We didn't know what you'd become. We didn't ask." It was, I think, the closest thing to an apology my father has ever offered me, though it was phrased as confusion rather than regret. I told him, "You didn't ask about a lot of things, Harold." I did not say it cruelly. I said it the way I state vital signs, as a fact that needed to be on the record. Then I went back into the unit because Saoirse's X-ray results were due any minute, and that mattered more, in that moment, than anything happening in the waiting room. The X-ray showed a small pneumothorax, confirmed within the hour, and Dr. Nwasu placed a chest tube to relieve the pressure on Saoirse's lung, a procedure I assisted with directly, my hands as steady around my niece's tiny chest as they would be around any stranger's child, because that steadiness is not something I turn on and off depending on bloodline. It is simply how I am trained to be. Saoirse stabilized within 6 hours. She remained critical for the better part of 2 weeks, but she did not require the more invasive interventions Dr. Nwasu had feared that first night. And by the end of the second week, she was on room air part of each day, a milestone that in that unit gets treated with the same quiet reverence other people reserve for far larger victories. Over the following days, my parents came to the hospital every single day, sometimes twice a day. I was there for many of those visits because I continued working my scheduled shifts, and I continued being Saoirse's charge nurse on the nights I was assigned to that pod. I want to be honest that this created an unusual, almost surreal several weeks, where I was simultaneously my parents' estranged daughter and the senior clinical authority over their granddaughter's care. I did not use that position to punish them. I also did not use it to perform some dramatic reconciliation for an audience that did not exist, because there was no audience. There was only a critically ill infant and the adults who loved her. However imperfectly, some of those adults had loved other children in the past. My mother tried, several times during those 2 weeks, to talk to me about the 7 years we had lost. She would corner me gently in the hallway outside the pod, her voice pitched low so as not to disturb anyone. "I know we weren't there for you the way we should have been," she said once, on the 9th day, with Ryan. It was the first time she had ever, in any context, acknowledged that failure by name. I told her I appreciated her saying that. I did not tell her it fixed anything, because it did not. And I have learned that agreeing something is fixed simply because someone finally named the wound is its own kind of dishonesty. My father, during that same stretch, asked me more questions about my actual job than he had asked in the previous 11 years combined. He asked what a pneumothorax was again, more carefully this time, wanting to actually understand rather than simply survive the conversation. He asked how I had ended up choosing the NICU specifically, and when I told him about volunteering at that same hospital at 15, folding linens on Saturday mornings, he went quiet for a long moment. "I remember you doing that," he said. "I didn't think much about it at the time." I told him that was, in a way, the story of my entire childhood. He didn't argue with me. Saoirse Rourke was discharged home after 31 days in the NICU, a strong milestone for a baby born at 27 weeks, weighing 4 pounds 9 ounces on the day she left, still small but stable, still needing a home apnea monitor, but no longer needing oxygen support. Bridget, who had been at the hospital constantly herself once she was physically able to be there, hugged me in the hallway the day Saoirse went home, and she cried into my shoulder in a way that felt genuinely uncomplicated, the first uncomplicated thing that had happened between the two of us in years. I want to say clearly that I do not blame Bridget for most of what happened in our family. She was a child being praised inside a system our parents built, the same as I was a child being managed inside it. Neither of us drew up the blueprints. In the weeks after Saoirse came home, my parents began reaching out more regularly, hoping, I think, that the crisis had reopened a door that could now simply swing wide again, back to something resembling a normal family. My mother called twice asking if Callum and Ryan and I would come for Easter dinner. My father sent a text, the first direct text message from him I had received in 7 years, asking if he could take Ryan, now 7 years old, to a Roanoke Rail Yard Dogs hockey game sometime. A gesture that felt both sincere and, to me, still slightly premature. I want to describe the conversation I had with both of them together about 6 weeks after Saoirse's discharge, because I think it is the truest picture of where this story actually landed. I asked them to meet me, not at their house, not at mine, but at a coffee shop near the hospital, neutral ground, the kind of place with good lighting and other people around. A setting I chose deliberately because I wanted the conversation to stay calm and specific rather than sliding into old emotional patterns none of us had fully outgrown. I told them I was glad Saoirse was healthy. I told them I did not regret, for even a single second, doing everything in my professional power to help her, and that I would do the same for any child who came through those doors, related to me or not, because that is simply who I am as a nurse and who I intend to remain. Then I told them the part that was harder to say. I told them I was not going to resume the relationship we had before, the one built on 34 years of me being managed instead of known. I told them I was open to something new, something smaller and more honest, built slowly, on different terms than the ones that had governed my entire childhood. My mother's face did something complicated when I said that, a flinch followed by something almost like relief, as if some part of her had been waiting 7 years for someone to finally draw a line she herself had never been able to draw. "What does that look like?" she asked, and her voice, for the first time in my memory, sounded genuinely uncertain rather than certain and simply wrong. I told her it looked like this. Occasional visits on my terms, at times I chose, in settings I chose. It looked like them earning, slowly, the right to be part of Ryan's life in a way they had never earned the right to be part of his infancy. It looked like no more comments about my career being a phase, no more comparisons to Bridget delivered, as though I couldn't hear the comparison inside the compliment. It looked like them accepting that trust, once broken as thoroughly as ours had been, does not snap back into place just because a crisis forced proximity. It has to be rebuilt in small pieces, and I would be the one deciding the pace. My father asked if this meant we were starting over. I told him no. I told him we were not starting over, because starting over implies erasing what came before, and I did not want it erased. I wanted it remembered by all of us clearly so that none of us repeated it. I told him I was willing to let them back into a version of my life, carefully, incrementally, but that the version of our family that existed before Ryan was born no longer existed and was not coming back. He nodded. He did not argue. I think, for the first time in his life, my father understood that agreement was no longer the only currency available to him. Understanding was going to be required too, and understanding takes longer to earn. I also want to describe something that happened about 2 months after that coffee shop conversation, because I think it shows how fragile and how real this new arrangement actually is. My mother called and asked, carefully, almost formally, if she could come to one of Ryan's speech therapy sessions, not to participate, just to sit in the waiting room and see him afterward for 20 minutes. It was a small request, and it would have been easy to say yes automatically, the way I might have once, eager for any sign of effort. Instead, I asked her why she wanted to come, specifically, and I listened to her answer before deciding. She said she wanted to see, with her own eyes, what she had missed by not coming to any of his early appointments, not to feel guilty about it forever, just to finally understand it. I thought that was an honest answer, so I said yes once, and I watched her sit quietly in a waiting room chair for 40 minutes without checking her phone once, which was its own kind of small data point in a much longer experiment. I do not know yet whether this becomes a pattern or a single gesture that fades. I have stopped needing to know in advance. That, more than anything, is the difference 7 years of silence built in me. That was 4 months ago. Since then, my parents have come to my house twice, both times by invitation, both times leaving when I indicated it was time to leave, which they have, without complaint, both times. My father took Ryan to that hockey game, and Ryan came home talking for a week about the mascot and the free foam finger, unaware of the years of context behind that one ordinary afternoon. My mother has not once in 4 months made a comment about my career being something other than what it plainly is. I do not know if that will last. I have decided not to organize my life around finding out. I go to work. I take care of infants who are fighting for their first weeks of life, related to me or complete strangers, with exactly the same steadiness either way, because that steadiness was never conditional. It was mine before any of this happened, and it will be mine after. When I sit back now and think about everything that happened across these 7 years, and the years before them, a few things stand out to me clearly. Being called fragile by someone is not the same as actually being fragile. My mother spent my entire childhood telling everyone I was the delicate one, the one who needed managing, and I absorbed that label so thoroughly that it took me until my 30s to understand it had never been true. It was a story she needed to tell so that another story, about Bridget, could exist alongside it. I think about that whenever I meet a family in my unit where one sibling has quietly been cast as the difficult one. Labels like that rarely describe the person they're stuck to. They describe what the family needed to believe. A crisis will show you exactly who shows up, and it will show you exactly who doesn't, and neither one is an accident. My parents did not fail to show up for Ryan's NICU stay because they were busy or distracted. They failed to show up because showing up was hard, and Bridget's healthy new baby was easy, and they chose easy every single time for 34 years. I don't think that choice was ever really about me specifically. I think it was about what my parents were willing to tolerate discomfort for, and the answer, for most of my life, was almost nothing. I ask myself now, in my own choices, what I'm willing to tolerate discomfort for, and I try to make sure the answer includes the people who need me most, not just the people who are easiest to love. Forgiveness and access are not the same decision, and you are allowed to make one without making the other. I have not slammed a door on my parents. I let them back into my life carefully, on terms I set, at a pace I control. But I did not hand them my whole trust back just because a hospital crisis brought us into the same hallway again. I think many people believe reconciliation has to be total or it isn't real. I don't believe that anymore. I believe you can open a door partway and mean it completely. Professional competence is not the same thing as being seen, and it took me a long time to stop needing my family to see the second one through the first. Standing in that waiting room in my scrubs, watching my mother read my badge, gave me a moment of vindication I won't pretend I didn't feel. But I want to be honest that vindication is not the same as healing. My parents finally understood what I did for a living. That did not automatically mean they understood me. I'm still working out, even now, what it would take for them to actually know their daughter rather than simply respect her job title. I think that's a longer project than any one hospital stay can finish. If you are the one in your family who got labeled the fragile one, the dramatic one, the one who can't handle things, I want you to hear this clearly. That label was never a fact about you. It was a role someone else needed you to play so their own story could make sense. You get to put it down whenever you're ready, even if the people who handed it to you never take it back themselves. I put mine down in a hallway on a Tuesday night in March, standing over an isolette that held my niece, wearing a badge that said exactly who I had become while nobody was watching. I hope, if you're carrying a version of that label right now, you find the moment where you finally get to set it down too. If this story meant something to you, I want to hear about it. Drop a comment and tell me about the door you had to close before anyone in your family finally understood what was on the other side of it. Type NICU if you know exactly what it feels like to build an entire life your family never once bothered to ask about, and to finally watch them see it anyway.